The room went silent when my sister's hand slammed the table and she shouted that I was nothing, that I had never contributed a single thing, that I was a burden sucking the life out of this family. And my mother's silence cut even deeper than her words, while my father turned his face away as if ashamed to claim me. And in that moment, with everyone's eyes burning holes through me, I felt like a shadow erased from my own bloodline. But deep inside, I whispered to myself that this pain would not be the end, because I am Madison Clark. And the very next day, I would sign the papers for a mansion that none of them could ever imagine standing in. The dining room smelled faintly of roasted turkey and rosemary, the kind of scent that was supposed to make a family gathering feel warm and welcoming. I sat at the long oak table in my parents' home in Springfield, Ohio, staring down at the plate in front of me, while the voices around me tangled like background noise I couldn't escape. My sister Rebecca, sitting across from me in her perfect navy dress, with her perfect posture, cleared her throat loud enough to silence the small talk. She tilted her wineglass toward me with a smirk that made my stomach twist. "Madison," she said, "maybe one day you will figure out what a real job looks like. Some of us cannot just sit around dabbling on laptops and call it work." A few chuckles rose from the far end of the table cousins who had grown up listening to Rebecca's sharp remarks, and somehow decided laughing along was safer than questioning her. I forced myself to breathe to focus on the fork in my hand, but the metal felt heavier than it should. My mother Evelyn clapped her hands softly like she was applauding. She beamed at Rebecca, her pride shining across the room like a spotlight. "Now that's ambition," she said, turning her eyes toward me. "Not everyone can be as steady and responsible as Rebecca. Some people just do not have it in them." Her words landed harder than the clink of crystal glasses, harder than the scrape of chairs. My father George kept his gaze fixed on the mashed potatoes, jaw tight but silent like always. He had perfected the art of pretending nothing was happening right in front of him. I swallowed hard and pressed my lips together. The words I wanted to say caught somewhere between my chest and my throat, burning. I had promised myself that tonight I would not rise to Rebecca's bait, that I would let her have her moment and walk away unscathed. But sitting there with her smug smile and my mother's approving nod, the air thickened around me until it was almost impossible to breathe. Rebecca leaned forward, her eyes locking on mine, the corners of her mouth curling. "Tell us, Madison, what is it you do again? Something with online shopping?" She tilted her head dramatically, pretending to think. "Or is it writing? No, wait. Maybe it was just scrolling all day." Her voice dripped with honeyed cruelty, and the table erupted in small, stifled laughs. I felt the blood rush to my face, hot and unforgiving. I gripped the napkin in my lap so tightly it crumpled into a ball. My pulse hammered in my ears, but I forced my voice low even. "I work, Rebecca. You just never cared enough to ask." That silenced the table for half a second before she threw her head back with a laugh. "Work," she repeated. "Please, you are 32 years old and still living under this roof. If that is work, then I am the Queen of England." My mother did not scold her. Instead, Evelyn placed her hand on Rebecca's arm and laughed along proud, as if her daughter had just won a prize. My father's knife scraped against the plate, a sound too sharp in the heavy silence that followed. He said nothing. He always said nothing. I felt something crack inside me. Not a loud break, but a hairline fracture that had been building for years. Every insult, every dismissal, every moment I was made to feel like an afterthought. My chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, my eyes stung, but I would not let them see me cry here. Not tonight. Rebecca's gaze swept around the table, gathering an audience for her next act. Her smile widened as if she had been waiting for this cue all evening. Finally, she turned back to me and raised her voice sharp enough to cut through every whisper, every shifting chair, every nervous cough. "You are nothing but a parasite. You live off this family like we owe you something. You are a failure, Madison. A failure. And I am done with it. Get out. Do you hear me? Get out of this house and do not come back." The words slammed into me harder than I imagined they could. The table went silent. Forks froze midair. My cousin's eyes darted between us, wide and uncertain. I looked at my mother, hoping for even a flicker of defense, but she simply shook her head as if agreeing. My father lowered his gaze to his plate, unmoving, refusing to intervene. I felt the walls of the dining room close in the chandelier lights too bright, the room too full of faces I thought I knew, but suddenly realized had never truly been mine. My throat tightened, my heart pounded, and I pressed my palms against the edge of the table to steady myself. I wanted to scream. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I sat frozen, the echo of her words hanging in the air, heavy and undeniable. And in that stillness, I knew something inside me had shifted forever. Whispers rippled across the table, low at first, then louder, as if my humiliation had given everyone else permission to voice what they had secretly thought. A cousin near the end leaned toward another, her words not quite hushed enough, saying, "Maybe Rebecca was right. Maybe it was time I figured things out." The sting of her agreement sliced through me worse than Rebecca's cruelty. I kept my eyes fixed on the tablecloth, tracing the embroidered flowers with my gaze, just to keep from breaking down right there. Evelyn's voice rang out clear and unwavering. My own mother looked at me with eyes that held no softness. "Madison," she said, "you need to grow up. It is time you learn to take care of yourself. We cannot carry you forever." Her fork clicked against her plate as she resumed eating, as if her judgment was nothing more than another course in the meal. The dismissal in her tone burned hotter than any insult Rebecca had thrown. I searched the room desperately for someone, anyone who might see me, who might believe that I was worth more than this picture they painted of me. Every face avoided mine. My cousins looked down into their glasses, my aunts busied themselves with passing dishes no one wanted anymore. My father stared at the roast as though carving into it would save him from choosing sides. I had never felt more invisible and yet so exposed. Then I heard the scrape of a chair. Uncle Robert, my father's older brother, leaned forward, his weathered hand gripping the edge of the table. "That is enough," he said firmly. His voice cut through the tension, and for a fleeting second hope bloomed in my chest. "Madison works harder than you think. Just because you do not see it does not mean it is not real. She deserves respect." Rebecca's laughter rang out before he could continue. "Respect for what? For lounging around and pretending to be busy. Do not romanticize laziness, Uncle Robert." Her words landed like stones, and several people nodded in agreement, eager to align themselves with the sister who always seemed untouchable. The swell of voices drowned his attempt at defending me, his protest swallowed by the tide of whispers and chuckles that rose again. I could not hold it in anymore. My throat closed tight, my chest ached, and tears stung the corners of my eyes. I pushed back from the table so fast, my chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound made everyone pause, but I could not stop. I stood clutching my crumpled napkin, like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. My vision blurred as the first tear slipped free, hot against my cheek. No one reached for me. No one called me back. The chandelier light shimmered above too bright, casting everything in sharp relief. Every face turned toward me with curiosity or judgment, but never compassion. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the doorway. My pulse thudded in my ears louder than the gasps that followed as I left the dining room without another word. I felt the cool air of the hallway brush against my wet cheeks, and my tears fell freely now, each step heavier than the last. By the time I reached the front door, the sound of muffled voices still trailed after me, Rebecca's shrill tone rising above the rest. I pressed my hand against the doorframe, trying to steady my breathing. The tears came harder, unstoppable, spilling over as I walked out into the night. The air outside was crisp, biting at my skin, and the quiet of the street only made the chaos inside my chest roar louder. I stood there under the dim porch light, trembling, my shoulders shaking as everything I had tried to bury for years came rushing up at once. I could still hear her voice echoing in my head, sharp and final. "Get out of this house and do not come back." My mother's silence, my father's cowardice, my family's indifference, all of it pressed down on me until I thought I might collapse right there on the steps. But I kept moving, wiping at my face with the back of my hand, the night swallowing the sound of my quiet sobs. Behind me, laughter rose again, muffled but cruel, as if my absence had already become another joke for them to share over dessert. I walked away from that door, knowing nothing in my life would ever be the same. The cold air clung to me as I walked down the quiet street, each breath sharp against my lungs. But my mind was far louder than the silence around me. Faces and words from the dinner table blended with memories I had tried to bury, and before I realized it, I was back in the world of my childhood, replaying the same lessons my family had taught me since I was old enough to understand what unfairness felt like. I was 12 when I first felt what it meant to be invisible in my own house. I had won a scholarship to attend a summer program at the local university. It was the first time I had been recognized for something that was mine alone, something I had worked for. I still remember the letter arriving in the mail, the paper crisp, my name printed in bold letters. I ran into the kitchen waving at my heart so full of pride I thought it might burst. But Evelyn barely glanced at it. Rebecca was sitting at the table, chin resting in her palm, and by the end of the week, the scholarship that had my name on it was reassigned in conversation, as if it had always belonged to my sister. She needed it more, Evelyn explained, because she was destined for greater things. I never argued. I stuffed the letter into a drawer in my room and cried myself to sleep, wondering why my best was never enough to belong to them. A few years later, there was the school trip to Washington, D.C., a trip I had begged to go on. I had worked odd jobs all year, cleaning yards and babysitting, saving every dollar I could. The night before the final payment was due, Evelyn sat me down with that look she always used when she was about to deliver a decision I had no say in. "We cannot afford for both of you to go," she said. "Rebecca will benefit more from this trip, so your money is better spent elsewhere." She did not even flinch when I told her it was my money. My father sat across the room reading the paper, pretending not to hear. Rebecca left the following week with a new suitcase and a camera that Evelyn had proudly bought her. I stayed home, the envelope of money gone, the dream gone with it. Walking now under the dim glow of the streetlights, the memories kept coming, each one a cut I had bandaged over, but never healed. There was the birthday, when Rebecca was given the gift I had asked for months in advance, the college fund that seemed to stretch endlessly for her, while mine evaporated into thin air. It had been a pattern, a script written long before I was old enough to fight it. Tonight at that table, her words had only been the latest act in a lifetime of scenes that always cast me as the unwanted extra. I stopped under a street lamp, the light pooling around me like a spotlight, and let the truth wash over me. It was never just about tonight. It was every time my voice was drowned out, every time my effort was erased, every time I was told without words that I was less. The dinner had only ripped the stitches off wounds I had carried since I was a child. I remembered being 16, watching Rebecca accept an award at school, while Evelyn clapped from the front row, beaming with pride. I had been nominated for a smaller recognition the same year, but Evelyn had chosen not to attend. She told me she could not be in two places at once, and Rebecca's event was more important. I stood alone, clutching my certificate, smiling for a photographer I did not know, while my parents' seats sat empty. That moment carved itself into me like stone. My legs felt heavy now, as if the memories themselves were weights pulling me down, but I kept moving. The sound of my footsteps on the pavement reminded me I was not a child anymore. I was not powerless, even if they had spent years convincing me I was. My breaths came faster, mixing with the steady rhythm of tears that had not quite stopped since I left the house. I reached the corner of the street and leaned against a fence, staring out at the rows of darkened houses. Behind those windows, families laughed, children argued over television shows, parents tucked kids into bed. Ordinary lives filled with the kind of belonging I had spent years craving. I pressed my palms against the wood, grounding myself against the ache rising in my chest. The unfairness of my childhood had shaped me, molded me into someone who learned early that love in my family was conditional and uneven. Tonight had not been an isolated cruelty, but the final confirmation of something I had known all along. I was never meant to be included, never meant to be celebrated. Rebecca was the chosen one, and I was the shadow expected to fade quietly while she burned bright. As the cold bit deeper into my skin, I realized with painful clarity that everything at that dinner table had been inevitable. Rebecca's words, my mother's coldness, my father's silence, even the laughter of my cousins, it had all been the natural extension of years spent teaching me that I did not belong. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes, drawing in a shaky breath. The memories crowded me, but also clarified something I had never allowed myself to admit. My entire life had been a series of exclusions, a long line of doors shut in my face, while Rebecca's path was paved smooth. Tonight was not the beginning of my exile. It was the end of my patience. I let my hands fall, staring down the empty road stretching ahead. Somewhere inside me, the pieces of those years of rejection clicked together, forming a picture I could no longer ignore. This was the last time they would push me out, the last time I would walk away with tears on my face. For the first time that night, my chest eased just slightly, replaced by a flicker of something sharper, steadier, alive, in the hollow place where grief had lived. The past had defined me long enough. Tonight had broken the surface, and I knew with a chilling certainty that the water could not close over me again. I closed the front door of my small apartment and leaned against it, the quiet pressing in around me like a blanket. My coat still smelled faintly of roasted chicken from the dinner table I had fled, but the scent turned my stomach now. I dropped my bag onto the floor and walked straight to my desk, the familiar hum of my laptop waiting like a friend who had never once betrayed me. The screen lit up, casting a pale glow across the room, and my fingers moved with practiced rhythm. I typed in the password one I had created years ago, when I decided no one in my family would ever see the life I had built in secret. Within seconds, the numbers filled the screen, cold and undeniable, yet they pulsed with a warmth I had never received from the people who raised me. My checking account, my brokerage, the portfolio I had guarded like a sacred treasure. Together they told a truth no insult could erase. Over $2 million. The figure sat there unblinking, and I stared at it with a mix of exhaustion and vindication. Rebecca's voice still echoed in my head, calling me a leech, an embarrassment, a failure. She had no idea that while she was being paraded as the family's golden child, I was spending nights hunched over this very desk, trading stocks, building websites, ghostwriting reports for clients who never knew my name, but paid me enough to keep climbing. My mind drifted back to those years, the nights when I drank too much coffee just to stay awake. The lamp would cast a lonely circle of light on the desk as I coded for hours, learning to design digital ads for small businesses, creating content for blogs I would never sign. The sound of the clock ticking was the only reminder that time was moving at all. I remember once falling asleep with my head on the keyboard, waking up to a string of nonsense letters that filled the page, and yet the deadlines were still met, the clients still satisfied. No applause, no recognition. Just steady deposits that slowly grew into something unimaginable for the girl my family thought was a burden. Crypto had been my gamble. I bought in when everyone around me scoffed back in 2015, when the headlines mocked it as a passing fad. I stayed up reading white papers, learning charts, sweating through the crashes, and holding through the climbs. When my portfolio doubled, then tripled, I told no one. Not my parents, not Rebecca, not even the few friends I trusted. It was mine, a secret carved out of the hours I had spent alone, rejected by the people who should have been my safety net. I scrolled through the history, the record of my work laid bare in numbers and dates. Each transaction was a scar and a triumph, proof that every moment of exclusion had fueled me instead of breaking me. I thought about the time Evelyn had told me to stop wasting hours on the computer, that it would never give me a future. She had no idea those hours were the reason I could look at my screen now and see freedom staring back. The laptop hummed softly, the fan spinning, and I leaned back in my chair, letting the reality sink in. Over $2 million. Enough to buy silence, enough to buy respect, enough to buy a new life. My chest tightened, not from fear, but from the sheer contrast between the image of me my family carried and the truth glowing in front of me. I remembered Rebecca's smug face at dinner, the way her lips curled when she spat the word parasite. If she only knew that I could buy and sell her twice over without blinking. The thought was sharp, almost cruel, but it steadied me. They had written me out of the story so many times, but now I held a chapter they could never have predicted. I reached for a folder I kept at the edge of my desk, filled with old pay stubs, freelance contracts, notes scribbled in margins during late-night brainstorming. I flipped through them slowly, each page a reminder of battles fought in silence. When the rent was barely covered, when my eyes ached from staring at the screen, when I was too tired to cook and lived on instant noodles, none of them were there. And yet here I was, not just surviving, but thriving quietly, amassing the kind of security they would never associate with me. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of the heater kicking in. I let my gaze return to the numbers on the screen. My hands trembled not from weakness, but from the thrill of knowing I no longer had to justify my existence. The proof was here, black and white, stronger than any insult, louder than any dismissal. For a long moment I simply stared at the account, the commas and zeros holding more weight than years of cruel words. My throat tightened, and I let out a laugh that cracked in the middle, half sob, half release. I was not a leech. I was not a failure. I had built something from nothing, and tonight, after all the years of silence, I allowed myself to feel it. I closed the folder gently and set it back in place, the edges worn from years of being opened in private. The glow of the laptop still lit the room, steady and sure. My reflection in the dark window looked different somehow, less like the broken woman who had left that dinner, and more like someone standing on the edge of a decision that would change everything. The number stared back at me, immovable, undeniable. And in its certainty, I felt a strength that had always been mine, but hidden. Whatever they thought I was, the truth was written here. And as I shut the laptop and let the room fall into darkness, I knew that this secret would not remain one for much longer. The next morning the phone rang before I had even finished my coffee. Rebecca's voice cut through the line, sharp and commanding, as if she had rehearsed every word. She said there was paperwork waiting at the house and I needed to come sign it. She did not bother with pleasantries. Her tone left no room for doubt. She wanted me out, legally bound and erased. I hung up without answering her final jab and sat staring at the quiet swirl of steam rising from my mug. My heart pounded with a mix of anger and resolve. The fear that used to hold me had been replaced by something steadier. I would not let her shove me aside as if I had no claim, no dignity, no voice. By noon, I was walking through the glass doors of a law office in downtown Columbus. The plaque read, "Daniel Brooks, Attorney at Law." Inside smelled faintly of leather and old books. The receptionist smiled politely before leading me to a corner office where Daniel, a man in his 50s, with calm eyes and a firm handshake, stood to greet me. We sat across from each other as I laid out the story, every detail from the dinner to the phone call that morning. He listened quietly, nodding at intervals, jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, his gaze was steady, professional, but not unkind. He explained that Rebecca could not legally force me to sign away my rights. If my name was connected to the property in any capacity, I had the right to refuse. His words landed with the weight of something I had been desperate to hear. I was not powerless. I was not trapped. I felt a rush of relief so strong it almost brought tears. For the first time in years, someone acknowledged that I had standing, that my voice mattered. Daniel leaned back and told me I had options. I could fight to stay, or I could walk away on my terms. Either choice would be mine, not Rebecca's. The decision formed in my chest as naturally as breathing. I did not want to cling to a house that had only been walls of judgment and cold silences. What I wanted was freedom, proof that I could exist outside of their shadow. That evening, I found myself scrolling through listings, my fingers shaking, as I clicked through glossy photos of houses in Columbus. One property stopped me cold. A sprawling white brick mansion with tall black shutters and a manicured lawn. The listing price read $1.8 million. My pulse quickened as I clicked through the photos. A marble staircase curved like something from a film set, light spilling through tall windows into rooms that seemed built to breathe. I could see myself there, standing in a space no one could belittle, no one could call small or shabby. My future unrolled in those images, like a promise waiting to be claimed. The next day I scheduled a viewing. The real estate agent, a woman named Carla with a confident smile, walked me through the grand foyer. My heels echoed against polished hardwood, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. Each room carried a quiet dignity. Fireplaces in 3 separate spaces, chandeliers casting warm light that danced across high ceilings. As I stood in the master bedroom, the city skyline framed by wide glass panes, I felt an ache deep inside me shift. This was not just a house. It was a declaration, a line drawn between who they thought I was and who I had become. When Carla handed me the paperwork, my hands trembled not from doubt, but from release. I thought about the years of ridicule, of being dismissed at dinner tables, of swallowing words to keep peace. All of it led me here to this moment where pen met paper, and I reclaimed what had been denied me. The ink dried quickly, smooth and final across the contract. My signature, my decision, my life. As I handed the pen back, I felt lighter, as if chains I had worn for decades had slipped to the floor. Carla congratulated me warmly, but her words blurred as a wave of quiet triumph swept over me. Walking out of the office, the crisp winter air filled my lungs. I looked down the busy street, the city alive with its own stories, and for the first time mine felt like it belonged. The mansion was not just a purchase. It was my freedom written in brick and stone, my proof that I was never what they claimed. I stood at the edge of the sidewalk, the contract folder pressed against my chest, and let the moment settle. Something inside me had shifted again, but this time it was not from humiliation. It was from the undeniable weight of release. That night, I packed in silence, folding clothes into the worn suitcase that had once traveled with me to college and back again. The room smelled faintly of dust and old perfume, the wallpaper faded in patches where posters had hung in my teenage years. Each drawer I emptied seemed to echo with the sound of laughter I had once forced, tears I had once hidden. The dresser top cleared until only a single photo frame remained, a picture of me at 12, standing beside Rebecca at a school play. I turned it face down and left it there. The floor creaked behind me, and I turned to see Uncle Robert in the doorway. He did not speak at first, just watched me zip the suitcase closed. His eyes carried that mixture of pride and sadness I had always recognized in him, as though he knew more than he let on. He stepped into the room slowly, his boots scuffing the wooden floor. From his pocket, he pulled out a small brass key, old and tarnished, the ridges worn smooth from years of turning. He held it out to me. I frowned, taking it carefully into my palm. He said in a quiet, steady voice that it was the key to his old cabin outside Dayton. He told me I deserved a life beyond this house and beyond the voices that tried to break me. His words broke through the wall I had been holding, and for a moment I could not speak. I only nodded, clutching the key tight until the metal pressed hard into my skin. He placed a hand on my shoulder, gave it a firm squeeze, and then walked out as quietly as he had come. I stood there with the key in my hand, feeling the weight of his belief in me heavier than the suitcase by the bed. I carried the luggage down the hallway, the house eerily still. Family photos lined the walls, smiling faces that had never felt like they belonged to me. At the bottom of the stairs, the living room was dark, only the glow of a lamp left on by habit. I paused to take one last look at the worn couch, the stack of magazines, the silence that had so often swallowed me whole. When I stepped outside, the cold air struck my face, sharp and bracing. The streetlight at the corner flickered, casting long shadows across the driveway. I dragged the suitcase toward the curb, the wheels rattling on cracked concrete. Across the street, Mrs. Harris stood on her porch, wrapped in a heavy cardigan, her arms crossed against the chill. She watched me with eyes that carried a sorrow I could not quite read. Perhaps she had heard the shouting the night before. Perhaps she had long known the way I was treated inside those walls. She did not call out, did not intrude, only gave me a small nod of acknowledgement, as if to say, she saw me, really saw me, for the first time. I returned the nod, a lump rising in my throat. Then I turned away, hauling the suitcase to the waiting cab at the corner. The driver stepped out to lift the bag into the trunk, but I kept my eyes on the house, its windows dark and unwelcoming. The front door stood closed behind me, the brass knob catching the light like a final taunt. My hand hovered in the air for a moment, wanting to wave goodbye to something that had never truly been mine. Instead, I exhaled and let the breath carry away the weight of years. As the cab door closed and the engine rumbled to life, I felt the shift inside me settle. Springfield blurred past the window, familiar streets falling away into the night. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and watched until the house was gone from sight, a shadow swallowed by distance. When the driver asked where to, my voice was steady. I gave him the address of a hotel in Columbus, my new city, my new start. The suitcase was heavy with memories, the key in my pocket heavier still. But as the road opened up before us, I knew I had left the past behind. The house of my childhood shrank into nothing more than a chapter, already closed its door shut, forever behind me. The cab rolled to a stop in front of a broad stone driveway, and for a moment I could not bring myself to open the door. The mansion stood before me, bathed in the warm glow of exterior lights that cast golden streaks across its brick facade. My chest tightened as I stepped out, my shoes clicking against the stone. The air smelled faintly of autumn leaves and fresh paint. The agent had already left the keys in the mailbox as promised, so I pulled them free and let the heavy iron gate swing shut behind me. My hand shook slightly as I pressed the key into the lock. When the door swung open, I was met with a rush of light and air, so different from the dim halls I had left behind. The foyer stretched upward with a vaulted ceiling, the chandelier overhead glittering, as though waiting for me alone. Polished hardwood floors gleamed beneath my feet, and the walls carried no photographs, no ghosts of anyone else's memories. This was my space, blank and untarnished. I wandered from room to room in a daze. The kitchen held marble counters that caught the light, and the stainless appliances gleamed as if they had never been touched. I ran my hand along the surface of the island, cold and solid under my palm, a promise of meals I would make for myself without judgment. The living room opened wide with windows facing the city skyline in the distance. Beyond them, Columbus sparkled alive and humming, but inside was silence, and for once it felt like a silence that belonged to me. Upstairs, the master bedroom sprawled larger than the entire floor I had grown up on. A balcony stretched outward, and I stepped onto it, the night breeze brushing my face. The city below looked alive, each light a reminder of the new life unfolding. My eyes blurred, but this time, the tears came from relief, not humiliation. For the first time, I let myself whisper aloud that this was mine. The words echoed softly against the high ceiling, no one there to contradict me, no one to tell me I did not deserve it. I unpacked slowly, arranging clothes into the walk-in closet, setting books along the shelves built into the wall. Each item placed felt like planting a flag, a claim on ground I had earned through years of unseen labor. The doorbell rang the next afternoon as I was struggling to lift a box of dishes onto the counter. Startled, I opened the door to find a woman about my age holding a basket of muffins. She introduced herself as Olivia Reed, the owner of the cafe 2 blocks down. Her smile was warm, her eyes curious but not prying. She said she had noticed the moving truck earlier and wanted to welcome me to the neighborhood. I hesitated, then stepped aside and let her in. She placed the basket on the counter and glanced around the house with quiet admiration. Over coffee, she told me about the area, the small bookstore she loved, the park where the community gathered on Sundays. Her voice carried no edge, no hidden judgment, only a genuine interest in who I was. For the first time in years, I felt the beginnings of connection, fragile, but real. When she left, she pressed her number into my hand and told me to stop by the cafe whenever I wanted. I promised I would, and I meant it. That night I sat alone on the living room sofa, the city lights glowing through the tall windows. My suitcase lay empty at the base of the stairs, my belongings finally at rest. I leaned back, letting the silence wrap around me, but it was no longer heavy. It was freedom. I looked around the vast space and felt the weight of a truth settle inside me. I had not just bought a house. I had stepped into a different world, one where my worth was not measured against Rebecca's shadow, one where no one could tell me to leave. My chest rose with a deep breath, and I let it out slowly, savoring the moment. Whatever came next, this was the beginning of it. A chapter unbound, a life of my own making, and as I sat in the glow of my new home, I knew with certainty that nothing would ever reduce me to silence again. Word of my purchase did not stay contained in Columbus for long. By the end of the week, I began to receive texts from distant cousins asking if it was true that I had bought a mansion. The wording of their messages carried both curiosity and disbelief, as if they were trying to reconcile the girl they had seen humiliated at the dinner table with the woman now living behind stone gates and high ceilings. I imagined the conversations that must have filled the Clark dining room back in Springfield. Evelyn clutching her pearls, insisting that there had to be some mistake. George remaining quiet as usual, unwilling to challenge her certainty. And Rebecca, her lips curling in that familiar sneer, telling them all it was impossible, that I had no money, no future, no claim to anything beyond their charity. But the whispers grew louder, and soon they became undeniable. A neighbor from our old street apparently drove by the property in Columbus and spread the news further. They described the sheer size of the house, the manicured lawn, the elegant stonework. Their words trickled through phone calls and Sunday lunches until the entire family tree was buzzing. One evening, my phone lit up with an unknown number. It was Aunt Carol, her voice quivering between awe and suspicion. She asked how I had managed it, how I had gone from the girl with no career to the woman with marble counters and a chandelier. I offered her no explanation, only a calm assurance that everything she had heard was true. The silence on her end spoke volumes. I could picture Rebecca pacing her bedroom, anger boiling, as she listened to relatives compare us in ways that once would have been unthinkable. For years, she had been the shining star, the one with the career and the compliments, while I was painted as the dependent shadow. Now the roles had shifted, and the comparisons cut her deeper than any words of mine ever could. I heard later from Uncle Robert, who called to congratulate me, that Evelyn had defended Rebecca at length, insisting that financial success was not the same as stability or respectability. He told me she looked pale when she said it, as if the very foundation of her favoritism was beginning to crack. He added gently that Rebecca had left the room in a fury, slamming the door behind her. The thought of her anger should have frightened me, but instead, it gave me an odd sense of peace. For once, I was not the one shrinking in a corner. Days passed, and the chatter did not fade. At a Sunday lunch, relatives marveled at the irony that the daughter who had been belittled was the one with a mansion, while the so-called success story was still renting a modest townhouse. The words stung Rebecca, and her pride, I knew, could not survive such scrutiny. One evening, as I was arranging books in the library, I felt an unease settle over me. I had not spoken directly with Rebecca since the dinner, but I could almost hear her voice in my head, sharp and venomous, plotting how to reclaim control. The thought made my chest tighten, though I tried to push it aside. The confirmation came in the form of a message from a cousin. Rebecca had told the family she was going to Columbus. She would not stand by while I played the role of triumphant sister. She was going to confront me to put me back in the place she believed I belonged. I closed my eyes and let the phone fall against the couch cushion. The inevitability of it settled like a storm cloud. She would come, and with her would come the fury of someone who had lost not just control, but face. That night I lay in bed listening to the distant hum of the city. My mansion, so vast and comforting, suddenly felt like the stage for another battle. My fingers clenched the sheets as I prepared myself, not with dread, but with a hardening resolve. If Rebecca came, I would not shrink this time. I would not bow my head or apologize for the life I had carved out. The wind outside rattled the windows softly, and I imagined it carrying whispers back to Springfield, carrying news of Rebecca's anger as she climbed into her car, her hands gripping the wheel tighter with every mile between us. I turned off the light and lay in the dark, knowing she was on her way, and that the confrontation I had avoided for years was no longer something I could postpone. The morning broke gray and heavy clouds hanging low over Columbus, as if the sky itself anticipated the storm about to arrive. I dressed slowly, every sound in the house amplified by the silence of waiting. By mid-morning, I saw her car rolling up the long driveway, her figure stiff behind the wheel, her jaw set in the same hard line I had seen so many times before. I stepped outside before she could pound on the door. The air was cool, the stone steps beneath my feet grounding me as Rebecca climbed out of her car, her heels striking the pavement with clipped precision. She stopped at the foot of the stairs, her eyes sweeping the facade of the mansion before fixing on me. Her voice cracked like a whip. "Where did you get the money, Madison?" Tell me right now." I felt the sting of her words not from their power, but from the desperation behind them. She wanted to reduce me again to fit me back into the box of the failure she had built for me. I steadied my breath and answered evenly. "I worked, I invested. While you were busy calling me useless, I was building something real." Her face twisted, the flush of anger spreading up her neck. "You expect me to believe that? You with no real job, no career. You were always lazy, always hiding in your room." I remembered those nights, the glow of my laptop in the dark, while everyone else slept, my body aching from long hours balancing freelance projects and research. The sacrifices no one saw, the constant hum of doubt in my own head, the exhaustion that had nearly broken me. I let those memories steady me now. "You never saw what I was doing because you never cared to look," I told her. Rebecca's eyes narrowed, but her voice faltered. "What did you do, Gamble? Get lucky." I shook my head slowly. "No, I studied, I worked, I saved. I bought into markets you never even tried to understand. Crypto, stocks, real estate. I learned how to make my own way." The silence stretched between us, heavy and unfamiliar. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in her eyes, a crack in the wall she always built so confidently around herself. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out, only the flush deepening across her face. I stepped down one stair, closing the space just enough to make sure she heard me clearly. "You threw me out, Rebecca. In front of everyone, you told me I didn't belong in that house. Now look around. This is mine. You don't get to stand here and demand explanations. You don't have that right anymore." Her lips parted, but the words stuck, her fury visible in the way her hands clenched into fists. She looked at the mansion again, her reflection flickering in the tall windows, her posture rigid and defensive. For a moment I thought she might lunge forward, but she only stood there trembling with the weight of her humiliation. The sound of a bird cutting through the heavy morning air seemed louder than it should have been. I could see her struggling, her pride battling against the undeniable evidence before her eyes. She wanted to call me a liar, to strip away what I had earned, but the stone walls and manicured gardens around us told a truth she could not erase. I let the silence linger before turning slightly toward the front door. "I don't owe you answers," I said softly. "Not anymore." Rebecca's breath hitched, sharp and bitter, but she did not follow me as I walked back up the stairs. I felt her eyes burning into my back, her presence pulsing with the same hostility that had defined our childhood. Yet beneath it, for the first time, I sensed her fear. At the door I paused, my hand on the cool brass handle, and glanced over my shoulder. She stood rooted to the spot, smaller somehow, against the backdrop of the grand house. Her shoulders slumped, and for a fleeting second, the anger in her face gave way to something closer to shame. I turned inside without another word, letting the door close between us, sealing her fury outside, and leaving me in the quiet strength of my walls. Back in Springfield, the old house that had once been held up as the family's pride began to show its cracks. Rain seeped through the roof with every storm, leaving brown stains on the ceilings and dripping steadily into pans Rebecca had placed in corners. The wiring sputtered, lights flickered, and sometimes whole rooms went dark without warning. What had always been painted as stability was now nothing more than a burden, and Rebecca carried it alone. The bank had sent letters, each stamped with warnings in red, each one colder than the last. Repairs were needed, payments overdue, and the mortgage balance hung heavy over her head. She called contractors, but their estimates made her voice tremble as she repeated the numbers back to herself. Evelyn hovered close, offering comfort in words, but not in action, insisting to anyone who would listen that Rebecca was strong enough to handle it, that she was the one who had always been responsible. At night, I imagined her sitting at that same dining table, where she had once told me to leave the papers spread before her, the ink smudging as her hands shook. Evelyn would scold her gently but firmly, blaming bad luck, blaming anyone but herself. The truth, though, was written in every crumbling corner of that house. The roof was failing, the walls damp with mold, and the foundation beginning to shift. Neighbors began to notice too. The once neat lawn grew patchy, and uneven paint peeled along the shutters, and gossip slipped easily through the streets of Springfield. I knew because messages found their way to me, people who had witnessed Rebecca's temper, her attempts to mask the strain. They described how she snapped at repairmen, how she argued with the bank clerks, her voice too loud, too desperate. Meanwhile, my mornings in Columbus were filled with sunlight. I would wake to the quiet hum of my new neighborhood, the air clean and unburdened by memories. I brewed coffee in a kitchen that gleamed, walked barefoot across polished floors, and let the sense of ownership settle deeper each day. I had carved this place from years of unseen effort, and now it held me in a peace I had never known. Rebecca's calls started soon after the worst of the repairs came due. She left voicemails tight with frustration, her words clipped and fast. She wanted help, though she never said it directly. She wrapped her pleas in accusations, telling me I had abandoned responsibility, that I should be contributing to the family. I listened to those messages in silence, the phone pressed cold against my ear, and then I deleted them without response. The contrast between us grew sharper with each passing week. She sank further into debt, her pride forcing her to handle it all, while Evelyn fanned the flames of her resentment toward me. They still clung to the belief that I owed them something, that my success was somehow an extension of their control. Yet Springfield's gossip no longer favored them. Whispers traveled quickly, and soon people spoke of me as the one who had built something lasting, while Rebecca, for all her stability, was drowning. I pictured her pacing the halls of that house, as buckets filled with rainwater, her temper flaring when another bill arrived. Evelyn at her side shaking her head, but never reaching into her own savings, insisting that Rebecca was still the strong one. And perhaps the cruelest part for her was knowing that the town was watching, that her once perfect image had cracked. One afternoon, a letter came to me in Columbus, forwarded from Springfield by a neighbor who still cared enough to pass it along. It was from the bank, mistakenly sent to my old address, detailing yet another overdue payment, the threat of foreclosure outlined in bold lines. I folded the paper carefully and set it aside, not out of responsibility, but as a reminder of the shift in balance. While Rebecca fought with the weight of a collapsing house, I spent evenings walking through my neighborhood, the golden glow of street lamps brushing the sidewalks. Olivia from the cafe would wave when she saw me, sometimes pressing a warm cup into my hands and asking how I was settling in. I answered honestly that for the first time, I felt free. The distance between Springfield and Columbus was not measured in miles, but in the sharpness of our realities. Her nights were filled with dripping ceilings and flickering lights, with letters she could not answer and repairs she could not afford. Mine were filled with the soft quiet of a new home, with the certainty that every sacrifice I had made had carried me here. As I closed the curtains one evening and looked out over the manicured lawn, I thought of her again, the house she had clung to, now pulling her under. I wondered if she remembered the night she told me to leave, if those words replayed in her head as she struggled to hold it all together. And in that thought, I felt no anger anymore, only the clear weight of justice unfolding exactly as it was meant to. The mornings in Columbus had a different texture, softer somehow, as if the air itself carried less judgment. I walked down the street toward the cafe, the hum of traffic muted by the quiet rhythm of this neighborhood. Olivia spotted me through the glass front and waved her smile bright against the early light. She had become a constant presence, her kindness effortless, and I found myself opening up in small ways I had never dared before. Inside, she poured me coffee without asking, sliding the cup across the counter like it had always been meant for me. She asked how the house was treating me, and I told her about the sunlight that poured across the kitchen each morning, how the silence at night wrapped around me, not like loneliness, but like peace. She nodded, listening in that way some people do when they understand that your words carry more than they say. It was through Olivia that I met David Miller. He was a regular at her cafe, a man in his late 40s with sharp eyes softened by humor. He worked in real estate, his name quietly well known in Columbus, though he wore it without arrogance. Olivia introduced us over coffee one afternoon, saying simply that David should hear my story. I hesitated at first, the instinct to hide my accomplishments still woven into me, but something about his steady gaze urged me to speak. I told him about years of freelance work, the endless nights spent studying market trends, the small risks that became larger ones, the growth of investments I never flaunted. His expression shifted from curiosity to respect, and he asked questions that showed he truly understood. For the first time, someone outside the chaos of family recognized me not as the black sheep, but as a woman who had built something real. He leaned back in his chair and said he had seen countless people inherit wealth or stumble into it, but rarely had he met someone who created it alone. The words lingered with me long after he left, not because they flattered me, but because they validated what I had always known, but never been allowed to claim. The community welcomed me in ways that Springfield never had. Neighbors stopped by with baked bread or flowers from their gardens. Conversations slipped easily from weather to local events. Olivia would invite me to small gatherings at her cafe after hours, where laughter filled the space and no one measured worth in titles or family standing. Each moment built a sense of belonging that I had craved since childhood, and it settled into me like roots taking hold. One evening as I walked home past the glow of porch lights, I thought about Rebecca and the house in Springfield. The bitterness that had once burned so sharp was dull, now replaced by something quieter. Revenge had driven me here, yes, but it no longer consumed me. The mansion was proof to them, but to me it was freedom, a doorway into a life I could finally choose. David stopped by my house one afternoon to drop off some documents he thought might interest me. He showed me development plans for parts of Columbus areas where investment would bring new life. He asked if I had ever considered expanding beyond personal holdings, working with others who shared the same vision. I surprised myself by saying I might. The thought of stepping further into the world of business, not from necessity, but from desire, stirred something new. As he left, he paused at the doorway and said that not many people carried the grit to turn betrayal into foundation. His words settled deep, and I realized he had seen through to the core of what this journey had been. That night, I sat in the living room, lights low, the windows open to a gentle breeze. I looked around at this space that was entirely mine and let gratitude wash over me. For years, I had begged for scraps of validation, waiting for my family to acknowledge me. But in this place, I understood that I no longer needed it. Their rejection had carved the path that led me here, and in some strange way, I owed my freedom to the very cruelty that had once broken me. The mansion was not just a wall of stone and glass. It was proof of resilience, of nights spent working when no one noticed, of a spirit that refused to stay silenced. I leaned back into the couch and closed my eyes, feeling the hum of a life that was finally mine, a life that would keep unfolding with or without their recognition. In that quiet, I felt something close to peace. It was not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of knowing that every scar had led me to this moment. And for the first time, I could say to myself without hesitation that I was glad it had all happened, because it had brought me here. It was late afternoon when I heard the knock, sharp and frantic, echoing through the wide halls of my house. I hesitated, already knowing who it must be. When I opened the door, Rebecca stood there, her hair disheveled, her eyes swollen from tears. The confident older sister who once towered over me with smug certainty looked small now, weighed down by something heavier than pride could mask. She tried to step inside, but I held my ground. Her voice broke as she said she needed help, that the roof in Springfield had caved in, that the bank was demanding payment, that bills were piling up faster than she could manage. She admitted that she was drowning. For a moment, I saw the panic of a person who had built her life on foundations that were already rotting, and I knew this was the moment everything had turned. I listened in silence, her words spilling out like a flood she could no longer control. She said family should support each other, that blood meant obligation. She begged me to lend money to save the house she had once called only hers. I let the silence stretch heavy between us until she began to squirm under the weight of it. Finally, I spoke steady and cold. I reminded her of the night she had stood in front of our relatives and told me I was nothing, that I had no place, that I should leave. I told her I had left, and that every step since then had been mine alone. My voice did not rise, but I saw her flinch at every word. When I said this was the consequence of her own choices, her face hardened for a moment, then collapsed into desperation again. She reached for me, But I stepped back, the light from the tall windows falling across the polished floor between us. I felt no triumph, only clarity. She muttered that I had changed, that wealth had turned me cold. But I knew the truth. Wealth had not changed me. It had simply revealed me, freed me from the cage she and our parents had built. I told her I would not be her savior, that I had saved myself, and that was enough. Her tears fell harder, and for a moment I almost pitied her, but then I remembered every year of silence, every meal where I was invisible, every word that cut me down. Pity was no longer mine to give. Rebecca left her footsteps uneven on the stone path, her figure swallowed by the long shadows of the evening. I closed the door not with anger, but with finality, as if sealing away the last thread that had bound me to that house in Springfield. The mansion glowed as the sun dipped, light pouring through the windows, wrapping around me like a crown I had earned. I stood in the center of it and breathed in the silence, not the suffocating kind of my childhood, but the silence of freedom. They once called me a burden, a failure, an outsider. Now I stood in a home they could never have imagined, not because it was larger or grander, but because it was mine, chosen and claimed. I did not need revenge written in their ruin. I needed only the truth, and it was already written in these walls, in every step I had taken to get here. I turned away from the door, walked deeper into the glow, and let the past fall behind me. They called me a freeloader. Today, I live in a house they could never dream of. I did not need blood to prove them wrong, only the truth. If this story touched something in you, stay with me for more journeys of finding justice and self-respect.